We're very, very pleased to introduce the next session, but just before I do, can I please remind you to keep your phones on silent, and if they do ring and you desperately need to answer the phone, please leave the venue through the back doors. Sounds obvious, but it bears repeating. This session is sponsored by the Bhaskar Bhasha series, so we're very grateful for them, without which it wouldn't happen. So please, could you join me in welcoming our speakers, Jim Mallinson, S.R. Bhatt, Sudha Gopalakrishnan, and they're in conversation with Vikram Chandra for this session, The Pleasures and Perfections of Sanskrit.
Can you hear me? Thank you and welcome. So since the title of our talk is the pleasures and perfections of Sanskrit, I thought we might start by asking each of our panelists, what is the pleasure that brought you to Sanskrit and has kept you there for your life, right? Because I think each of you has spent a lifetime working in this area. So I was wondering if maybe we could start with Sudha and you could talk about your relationship with the language.
Thank you, Vikram. The topic itself is so broad, so I didn't know how I would get to this topic, and finally I thought that maybe I should start with myself and my own engagement and how I drew pleasure from Sanskrit, rather than talk about the bigger picture instantly at this point of time. I would say that for me, Sanskrit was a pleasure rather than a pain, studying Sanskrit, engaging with Sanskrit, because I'm coming actually to this stage, or I came to learn Sanskrit from an oral tradition, starting with an oral tradition. I am very happy to say that I had two parents, and my parents were very much knowledgeable in Sanskrit, and they used to engage with Sanskrit a lot, and that became a kind of, not just reading Sanskrit, but also in reciting shlokas and reciting poetry. So it became more of an oral tradition rather than, one advantage that I saw about that was to have the sounds seep in, the sounds, the meters, the alliterative, the shlesha, the yamaka, the different beauties of Sanskrit in a way seeped into my system. So maybe that was one good entry point for me. Later, of course, I did learn Sanskrit, and my PhD I did on Bhasha, the Sanskrit dramatist, and again through Kudiyattam, which has been a lifelong passion with me, which is a Sanskrit theatre. So Kudiyattam again gave me the impetus to learn texts, drama texts, the plays, the great plays of all the Bhasa or Kalidasa or all of those people. At the same time, it also gave an idea about the aesthetics behind the rasa, the Natya Shastra and all this. So it has been a journey of pleasure for me and not so much of pain. So this is my first experience with Sanskrit.
Sarvebhyo Namo Namaha. Salutations to all. My acquaintance with Sanskrit is right from my childhood. And being a student of philosophy, I have been more interested in philosophical literature in Sanskrit, in Pali, and also in Prakrit, which are the classical Indian languages. We have very ancient saying, Bharatasya pratishthe dve Sanskritum Sanskritis tatha. Indian culture is known for the richness of Sanskrit language, as well as the enhanced character of Indian culture. The Rishi of Yajurveda avers, Sa Prathama Sanskriti Vishwavara. Indian culture is very ancient, maybe most ancient in the world. And it is having such ideas and ideals, such value schemas, which are universally acceptable. Vishwa Vara. Because it comprises not only the goals and the means for individual enhancement, social solidarity, but also cosmic well-being. And therefore, Indian culture has ideas that way. Every culture of the world has something to say, something to offer, but Indian culture is characterized by richness in ideas. And that's a point of attraction for Sanskrit language. Secondly, every branch of knowledge, empirical as well as trans-empirical, technically we call it as aparavidya and paravidya. Well, every branch of knowledge is found expression in Sanskrit literature, whether it is mathematics, natural sciences, physical sciences, social sciences, literature, philosophy, everything is there. So it's very comprehensive, very broad-based. And we have enormous literature in Sanskrit. In fact, once upon a time, Sanskrit was a pan-Indian language. Everyone was speaking in Sanskrit. And of course, with colloquial languages as well. But Sanskrit was the official language all over the India. And all ancient Indian sanskaras, we have enumeration of 12 or 14 or 16 sanskaras. They are all in Sanskrit too, and they are abided by all over India, particularly by the Hindu community. And therefore, Sanskrit has that sort of richness. I will later on dwell upon two aspects of Sanskrit. One is the literature part of it, and other is the language part of it. And both are, in fact, something which is to be appreciated, to be, in fact, accepted, and, if possible, practiced as well. So I hand over the mic to
I think I've got my... Okay, well, thank you very much. And yeah, very delighted to be here. And thanks, Vikram, for chairing. Unlike my co-panelists, I think I probably had hardly even heard of Sanskrit until I was 17. And then I had to, I was choosing what I would do at university, and I didn't want to continue with any of the subjects I'd done at school. That was maths, physics, and Latin. And I was reading through the prospectus of Oxford University, dismissing everything, getting a bit nervous as I got towards the end. And then I got to Oriental Studies, and I thought, actually, well, this sounds rather interesting. I was interested in languages. And of course, the main language taught in the Oxford Oriental Institute is Chinese. And that was sort of the obvious way to go. And I went for an open day at the Oriental Institute, and there was a lecture given by the professor of Chinese. Now, it was rather dull and uninspiring lecture, and I sat through it thinking, oh my God, I don't want to do this either. What am I going to do? And at the end of it, he said, if anyone's interested in Sanskrit, the two Sanskrit professors are in the office at the end of the corridor. So I thought, well, I've got nothing to lose here. And I wandered down to their office, and it was Professor Richard Gombrich and Professor Alexis Sanderson, two very eminent Western Indologists, and they completely inspired me there and then. And a friend who's older than me had just come back from a gap year in India, so between school and university, and he'd had a wonderful time, regaled me with all these stories, and I put two and two together, and I thought, well, yes, I think I'll go for this. And then I went off to India on my gap year with a dear friend of mine, Alex Watson, who actually sadly is not here right now because he's speaking on another panel he's speaking about Indian traditions of atheism. And so this gap year changed both of our lives, as I now teach Sanskrit at SOAS at the University of London, and he's the professor of Indian philosophy at Ashoka University. So I then, after my Sanskrit degree, I continued going back to India, and I think it's what really has made me continue with my Sanskrit studies is the way that, a fascination with India and Indian culture, and of course the way that in India, as much as anywhere else in the world, I think that history is, so relevant today, and one of the ways to access that history is through the Sanskrit literary tradition. So that's what I've been doing with my research ever since, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. But that's the story of how I became a Sanskrit aficionado.
Thank you. And this is a question for all three of you. The description of our talk also talks about Sanskrit as a perfect language, right? And that's an idea, a phrase that kind of floats around in Indian culture, and without very much discussion of why actually we believe that to be so. So I was wondering if any of you, all of you, could speak to this idea of why do we believe it's a perfect language, and why are we so invested in this idea?
As I said, there are two parts in our deliberations. One is the language and other is the literature. Sanskrit language is perhaps the most ancient language in the world. And it is at the same time most compact and perfect. Panini gave a very systematic formulation of Sanskrit grammar, such that on the basis of that, you can have newer and newer combination of words, and you can have newer and newer vocabulary. Basic framework is provided by Panini, but he has also given us the mechanism for increased vocabulary. This apart, the Sanskrit grammar is universally recognized as computer friendly because it has a binary approach to analyze language, which is also the language of a computer. And Sanskrit language has another characteristic. You can express ideas in most breviest possible form through abbreviations. We call it a sutra. In sutra form, a vast amount of knowledge can be compressed. And of course, the sutra has to be understood with the help of commentaries and other expositions. But then, the sutra literature is another characteristic of Sanskrit language. At the same time, in Sanskrit language, we also have abstractions. And therefore, it gives a formal analysis of different parts of language. Sanskrit grammar in this sense is compact as well as perfect. And another characteristic of Sanskrit is that, and we have very popular saying also, that all that is real is knowable. And all that is knowable is expressible in language. And Sanskrit language has that capacity to express nuances of thought, and it is thought which captures the richness of reality. So it deals with all the three: reality, knowledge, and language. So this is the beauty of Sanskrit. Another beauty which we were just discussing is that, from one composition you can pass on to another composition. From that you can pass on to another. Like this you can have 32 rounds and come back to the original. Or one single alphabet can be used to compose one verse. The entire verse with one single alphabet, maybe a or n, etc. Well, in no other language you have this characteristic that one single alphabet can be used to compose an entire verse. So there are many such features of Sanskrit language, and in that context, I would say that it is also not only compact but also comprehensive. Thank you. Example, you can give about
Okay, how a single verse can be interpreted into different shades of meaning is a very simple shloka in Ramayana. When Rama goes to, Sita goes to Kausalya, no, sorry, I'm so sorry, Bharata goes to Kausalya and asks permission to go to the forest to accompany Rama and Sita. And Kausalya says one simple sentence, Ramam Dasharatham Viddhi, Mam Viddhi Janakatmajam, Ayodhyam Atavim Viddhi, Gachatata Yatha Sukham. Which means that, you consider Rama as your father, Dasharatha, and you consider Sita as your mother, me, and you consider Ayodhya, the forest as Ayodhya, and with this knowledge you happily go. So this is a very simple first layer of understanding, but in the commentarial aspect, they draw out more than 11 interpretations of this brief shloka, and how I think I could ask Professor Bhatt himself, but basically saying that the Ramam, Dasharatham, there are many implied meanings. For example, if you're going, beware of what you're going to. When you may find that Rama also may have the same fate as Dasharatha, and Sita may come to suffer, and the whole forest of Ayodhya will become as complex as the forest life is going to be very complex for you. With all this, you can go. And there are many, many versions that can be drawn from this one single shloka. So this kind of, versatility is very, very unique to Sanskrit, I think. To cite just that one example.
Sorry, no, go ahead, Jem, please.
Thanks. Yes, just to recap, Professor Bhatt, I'm not sure that everyone knows about Parnani, who was mentioned by Professor Bhatt. So in probably the 5th century BC, he codified the rules of Sanskrit. And so since then, it's been perfected. That's what Sanskrit means. And anything that doesn't obey those rules is not Sanskrit officially. But and I've had the great privilege of working with and translating some wonderful expert Sanskrit kavis, poets, Kalidasa and so forth, who write in the most perfect, chaste, beautiful Sanskrit. But in terms of my personal relationship with it, I'm a bit worried now because the last 10 years or so I have been devoting my research mainly to texts on yoga and tantra, and they are often written in actually a slightly barbarous Sanskrit. My skills are slipping somewhat, I think. I'm probably not quite as good as I used to be on the very perfected stuff. But the commentators and so forth, they make up there's two terms actually in earlier texts, so in sort of Vedic texts and so forth, where there are words that don't obey those rules. They're known as arsha, so the language of the rishis. There's a kind of a special get-out clause. And in the text that I work with, the language, when it's often a bit barbarous, is called Aisha, so from Isha, Shiva. It's the language of Shiva, and excuses are made. So not all Sanskrit is perfect, but I don't think we should ignore it when it isn't. That's just, I want to bang the drum for my field as well.
Right. I'm supposed to be the presenter, so mostly my job is to shut up. But I can't resist adding, just one more thing about Parnini's grammar, right? And I'm a computer geek and a programmer, and so what I want to sort of bring across to you is that his grammar, the Ashtadhyayi, is the world's first generative grammar. That is to say that it is an algorithm which works on phonemes and on verb roots, and by running a system of algorithmic rules, produces language, right? And this is astonishing. You can print the rule set out in 40 pages, right? So within 40 pages, the man has defined a way to generate an endless infinity of language, right? Okay, so but that is not all. Right? As a computer geek, let me just go on and geek out for like a couple more minutes. One is that when we think of general computability, right, the ability to mechanize computation, we think naturally of the Turing machine, right? But the Turing machine is not the only way of encoding computation. A man called Alonzo Church created a thing called the lambda calculus, which is also capable of doing anything that a Turing machine does. Right? There was another man named Emil Post who invented another system of simple substitutions which can also do everything that a Turing machine can do. Now, Panini's Ashtadhyayi is not a Turing machine, but the system of meta-language and recursive rules that he uses to encode his algorithm is capable of encoding general computation, right? Now, just think about this for a moment. It's mind-blowing. If you're interested in this stuff, there's a paper available on the web, which is called Panini's Grammar and Modern Computation by a man named John Kadvani, Kadvany. And you should go and find that and read it. And when you think about this, that the world that we live in today, which is pervaded by software, has been, in a sense, predicted and, in a sense, influenced by this one amazing Shastra created in 500 BCE, that is quite mind-blowing. Anyway, I'll shut up here and go on to the next question. Sorry, go ahead, sir.
I would like to point out two other features of Sanskrit language. One is its flexibility. Say we have a sentence, Ramah vanam gacchati. We can also say gacchati Ramah vanam, or vanam Ramah gacchati. All the three formulations mean the same thing. It's not necessary that there should be subject-predicate distinction. Subject should come first and predicate should come thereafter, and the verb should be in the middle, etc. That's not the case in Sanskrit. So this sort of flexibility. Another feature of Sanskrit is that whatever is written is also spoken. Perfect parity between writing and speaking. In English, it's not so. For example, beauty, but beauty, put. But and put. Well, there is no parity there, but that's not the case in Sanskrit. So Sanskrit, therefore, has, and the third feature is the figures of speech. So many varieties of figures of speech are there, and these figures of speech are in the form of analogies, are in the form of comparisons as well, and technically we call them as upma or yamaka, shlesha, and so forth. So these Sanskrit language therefore is very much ornamental.
Right. To move on a little bit, so when I was growing up, there was a kind of pervasive belief that Sanskrit was a Brahmanical language used by a small elite to exclude and exploit other people over the centuries. Yesterday, I did a presentation on a particular form of Chitrakavya, of Sanskrit poetry called Chitrakavya, and after that, somebody actually came and said exactly that to me, that don't you think Sanskrit is an exclusionary tongue? So I was wondering if all three of you, based on your research, could talk a little bit about who do you think actually use Sanskrit?
Well, I think most of what is being said about Sanskrit, I think in this context, pertains to more scriptural literature, which I think at that time was a preserve of a few people, the Brahmins for that matter. But when it comes to what we call disciplines, scientific literature, I think there was more vaster access for people to study, to understand, But having said that, of course, there were dialects also. I mean, there was also Prakrit, there were the other languages, I mean, which was not, for example, even in a Sanskrit play, the hero has the privilege to speak in Sanskrit, whereas the woman has the privilege or otherwise speaks only in Prakrit, or rather in Prakrit, which is not, I'm not putting Prakrit as down to Sanskrit in this case. But I must also point out that the Vidushaka, who's almost always a Brahmin, again speaks in Prakrit. So then I don't know where this gradation comes from and how this is, I mean, how this happens. I would like to ask you that question.
Sanskrit has not been the language of so-called Brahmins only. We have many sages and seers belonging to other categories of society who used to speak in Sanskrit, argue in Sanskrit. For example, King Janaka. Janaka was not a Brahmin. He belonged to the Kshatriya community, but he was a great philosopher. So it's wrong to say that Sanskrit was associated only with one particular caste. Or, see, in the Vedas, we have 32 rishikas, female seers. They are enumerated, 32. And during the Upanishadic time, we have famous lady saints like Maitreyi, Gargi, and so forth. And therefore, it's again wrong to say that only male people were using Sanskrit and not the female. Sanskrit has been used by the business community as well. And in the Arthashastra of Kautilya, we find many such references, because most of the terms which were used either in political discourse or in commercial discourse were in Sanskrit only. So Sanskrit was in fact pan-Indian, right from the, you can say, the so-called elite to the so-called masses. And therefore, it's wrong understanding that it was confined to one particular section only. Of course, along with Sanskrit, Pali and Prakrit were also popular. But remember one thing, whenever any subtle thought is to be expressed, Sanskrit was resorted to, not only in the Vedic tradition, but also in the Jain tradition. We have many scriptures of Jain tradition written in Sanskrit. And same is the case with Buddhism. Buddhist tradition. In Buddhism, we make a distinction between Pali Buddhism and Sanskrit Buddhism. And vast amount of philosophical literature in Buddhism is in Sanskrit only. Therefore, Sanskrit was not confined to any one particular group or a section.
Yes, I don't have much to add to that. I mean, I would say that predominantly Sanskrit has been the language of the Brahmanical tradition, but in terms of my own research, just to sort of add to what Professor Bhatt just said, I've recently been working on a text that's the first text of the tradition of Hatha Yoga, so physical yoga practice. And I probably might show it a bit later, I don't know if now's the moment, but a very interesting manuscript I've been working on. And much to my surprise, it's from close reading of that manuscript, it's become clear that it was the text itself was written by a school of tantric Buddhists, and it's a text in Sanskrit. So yes, this is a clear example of another tradition using Sanskrit, and it's not particularly it's not a sort of deeply philosophical work. It's more a practical work. And yes, clearly by Buddhists. So there's another exception. But I think we can say that in general, Sanskrit has been the preserve of the Brahmanical tradition. I don't know if you would disagree, but I think...
Right. Just to sort of add a little bit of interesting archaeological evidence to what we were just talking about. I just last week... Oh, I'm so sorry. So I was saying, just to add a little bit of interesting archaeological evidence that I recently became aware of last week. So I've been reading this account, an official report of an excavation on the island of Socotra, which is off the coast of Africa, which was very much on the trade routes between the coast of India and Egypt, through which there was a huge trade leading all the way to Rome. And Socotra, and particularly one cave called Hawk, was used as a way station for the sailors who went through, or for all the travelers who went through. So there are a total of 193 graffiti written in Indic languages, Brahmi and other ones, scripts on the walls, right? And they're of the same kind of graffiti that you and I write today, right? It's stuff like Jayadeva was here, right? So out of these 193, only 21 are in other Indic languages. And 159, which is something like 82%, are in Sanskrit, and recognizably in Sanskrit. And in some of them, the writer of the graffiti identifies his profession, and they include things like Vani, trader, Aramika, gardener, Navika, boat captain, and Shramana, Buddhist monk, right? So I just want to throw this out to you guys. If these people, if boat captains and traders are writing in Sanskrit, what does that then tell us about the widespread use of Sanskrit? Who is using it, and how are they using it?
Same is the case with Southeast Asia. If you go to Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, Korea, or even Japan, you will find many archaeological remnants which are in Sanskrit. Unfortunately, archaeology is not very well developed in these countries. And it is, in fact, it's a duty of the government of India, particularly the Archaeological Survey of India, to go to these countries, dig out the hidden manuscripts, and those manuscripts will be in Sanskrit only. And therefore, Sanskrit has been a language for business community. It has been a language for religious mendicants. The spread of Vedic thought in Southeast Asia in the beginning, and subsequently of Buddhism, is an evidence of the prevalence of Sanskrit in those countries. People were familiar with Sanskrit, and that's why they could converse in Sanskrit and do their business or religious practices. So Sanskrit, therefore, is, I won't call it as a dead language, as some people mistakenly said so. Take the case of, say, this Hebrew. Once upon a time, Hebrew was not a spoken language. But after the formation of Israel, Hebrew has become a living language, such that right from first school to research level, they are using only Hebrew. They are not using English as we are doing in India. Entire system of education in Israel is conducted in Hebrew language only, which was once declared to be a dead language. But Sanskrit has been a living language. It is being spoken throughout the ages. And even now, we have not less than 70 newspapers and journals in Sanskrit. It's 70, it's not a small number. So, Sanskrit has that potentiality, provided we pay proper heed to it. And see, our political setup is such that it has not promoted Sanskrit, which it should have. Thank you.
Again, maybe one of the ways in which Sanskrit spread to all these South and Southeast Asian countries is also because of the ease with which it merged with the local language. There are also many instances of that, including the Kakavin, a form that developed which blended Sanskrit and the local language, and a new kind of poetry emerged there in the Javanese literature. Same way, we have examples in South India also of something called Mani Pravala, which is a blending of coral and pearl, which is a kind of smooth blending. They say Bhasha Samskrita Yogo Mani Pravala. How the words and the cases mingle together to make a different kind of language, which blends Sanskrit, and great works of poetry, great works of kavya have been written. So that also goes for the versatility of Sanskrit to take all these together. Even when you're talking about scripts for that matter, many scripts are, it's also, for example, I learned my language, my Sanskrit, not by Devanagari, but learning through the Malayalam script. So in any text also, for example, something from Orissa, Gita from Orissa, anything can be written in the script of that language, but the language can be broadly Sanskrit. So this is another.
Yeah, just a quick little anecdote. It sounds to me like the archaeological data you're talking about, suggest that perhaps Sanskrit was being used as some kind of lingua franca. And I did once have the opportunity, it did once help me out. Many years ago, I fly paraglide as a passion of mine, and I flew off a mountain in Karnataka. It was a mountain called Kodachadri near a town called Kollur, and I got blown right off course and had to land in a clearing in the jungle. And there were just a few houses nearby and nothing else for miles around I'd seen as I come down. So I had to work out how to get back to the town. I had no idea, and I had no Kannada at all. But it turned out that this little community was a Brahmin community, and several among them could speak Sanskrit. And so I was able to ask directions in Sanskrit and find my way home after that.
So I think Professor Bhatt ji has already pointed us in this direction, but I wanted to ask, why should we as individuals and as a culture care about Sanskrit? What can we hope to gain from a study and an encounter with our past, which may not even be past?
Sanskrit is a language which embodies, as I said earlier, all disciplines available on the earth. And therefore, it should not be taken as something parochial or something confined to one particular community. It's a language of knowledge. It carries the knowledge tradition, and the knowledge is holistic in the sense that it deals with different disciplines. At the same time, it integrates all the disciplines. A study of mathematics is not devoid of relevance to physics or chemistry. So a study of spirituality, again, is not devoid of empirical disciplines. So that sort of holistic approach is there in Sanskrit. And then finally, I would say that Sanskrit language not only relishes, not only is joyful and joy-yielding, it also enhances our personality because of the value schema that it propounds. And therefore, for the sake of knowledge part of it, I think Sanskrit needs to be studied. Of course, language has its own niceties, and that should be appreciated. But the knowledge content which is embodied in Sanskrit literature, I think that is valuable and should be valued. That's my submission.
It's a very important question, that a statement that Professor Bhatt has made, because again, going back to a personal experience, I had the privilege of heading a manuscripts mission, national manuscripts mission for 5 years, and it was at that time that one could see the extent of disciplines that are inherent in our knowledge, in what we call as our knowledge systems in Sanskrit, also in the Indian languages. I mean, it spreads from any field of activity, from architecture to aesthetics, to beauty, to medicine. I mean, the spread was spellbinding and so vast. And just to take one example, when somebody asked me, is there anything in your database on medicine, for example? I mean, I have an eye problem. Is there anything in your database that you have a text on specifically treating eye problem? A kind of casual search throughout more than 500 original manuscripts, and I'm not saying copies, of only on the treatment of the eye. So if that were the extent of just one small example, how much knowledge would be contained in Sanskrit? And definitely, I think all the manuscripts need to be documented, need to be studied, need to be interpreted, not just by Sanskrit scholars, but those who have disciplinary strength in mathematics. You were talking about mathematics. A text of Leelavati, for example, is so simply stated, but at the same time, it has such complex ideas. That is the other thing, how verse is treated, taken into use for saying complex things. So many of these wonders are inherent in our manuscript heritage. It's high time that not just Sanskrit scholars, of course, with all respects to Sanskrit scholars, but all medicinal or mathematics or physics or architecture, everybody needs to engage with manuscripts, and they'll find many, many, many new treasures, and I'm very, very confident about that.
Just to add to that, I had the privilege last week actually of being given a tour around the headquarters of Namami, the National Manuscript Mission in Delhi, and they've currently listed 42 lakh, so 4.2 million manuscripts, of which I think only 2 lakh so far have been digitized. Estimates of the total number of Sanskrit manuscripts in India range between 1 and 3 crore. Okay, and if you compare that to the heritage of classical Europe, of Greece and Rome, there's a total of 30,000 manuscripts available. And I was at the University of Baroda about 10 days ago, and that's the equivalent. They have 30,000 Sanskrit manuscripts there, just in one single library. So yes, I think it's extremely important that, I mean, there's a fantastic work being done by Namami, the National Manuscript Mission, in digitizing all these texts, because of course, all these manuscripts, because of course the weather conditions, particularly in India, are not very kind to paper and so forth. But it's very important that India keeps producing scholars that are able to read these manuscripts, and because there's so much more knowledge in there waiting to be accessed.
I made a large amount of Sanskrit literature is lost in oblivion because of some historical circumstances. And still, a large part of it is in manuscript form, not so far published. And some of the manuscripts are well preserved, but some are also not properly preserved. They are owned by some families, and they don't want to part away with those manuscripts. I think if the manuscripts are not properly preserved and published, it will be lost to the whole humanity, not just to India.
Right. I feel very passionately about this, that my friend Dominic Wojastik, who is a Sanskrit scholar, wrote a recent paper in which he quoted a person named David Pingley, who spent his entire life studying manuscripts. And David Pingley said that in his estimation, there might be as many as 30 million manuscripts, pre-modern manuscripts, existing in the subcontinent today. Right. Now, of that number, we lose a few hundred every week due to deterioration, weather, insects, and so forth. So, and I think the National Manuscript Mission is doing a really good job, but I think we need private efforts to help in the digitizing of these manuscripts before they're lost forever, right? And so, if any of you have any ideas, and especially if any of you have money, I have the technical access. I know people who have done manuscript digitization. So please get in touch. And Dominic and I have a plan, but we don't have any money. Right? and we're very bad at raising money. So we need somebody to help us find money to do this. Okay, sorry. That was another sidebar by the presenter, which shouldn't have been in there, but.
Not just money. One has to part away with the manuscripts which one is possessing and is not properly being documented or looked after.
So my final question, so the current government has proposed a new education policy which is proposing to make Sanskrit compulsory in all schools. And this has caused a great deal of controversy. There are already protests going on. I read one of the protest documents which called this a neo-Macaulay and a new Manuvadi dharma, which was being set in place, right, as a part of a saffronization, as it were. And I was wondering if any of you guys, our panelists, had opinions about this. Should Sanskrit be made widespread and available in schools?
Well, there is no question that Sanskrit should be made widespread. There's no two opinions about that. But how to do it is the only question. I mean, is it by imposing Sanskrit in schools? By imposing, I mean, by making it that you have to learn Sanskrit. Is that the way to go about it? Or is it by choice? I mean, do students have a choice to take it or not? I mean, I would opt for the second option, because India is too diverse to be, I mean, at this point of time, there are so many languages, so many dialects, so many cultures. If we just impose it from this kind of a school level, it will be a little bit nascent. We can have incentives, we can give support to learn Sanskrit, and if you learn, these are the things that you can do. That is one way of taking it, but to give a kind of total imposition, I think, may not work in India, is what I feel.
Of course, no language should be imposed, but language should be made attractive enough so that students opt for it. And it can be made attractive if you put such content in the textbooks which are useful for development of personality of the child. The textbooks should be not boring, but should be interesting, and at the same time instructive. Say, for example, when I was a child, I was taught a text which we will be giving Hamari Gaurav Gathaएं, stories of the saints and seers, etc., which are to be emulated. So these are such. So we have to recast our textbooks and make them interesting and instructive. And for Indians, I would like to say, Baba Saheb Bhimrao Ambedkar in the Constituent Assembly pleaded, kindly note, pleaded that Sanskrit should be the national language. He was the constitution framer, and he insisted, but then other people said, oh, no, particularly Nehru was not favor of Sanskrit, and Sanskrit therefore could not become a national language. Otherwise, had Ambedkar had a say, Sanskrit would have been the national language, like Hebrew as a national language of Israel.
I completely agree with you about making the teaching of Sanskrit more attractive. I have to say, when I was in school, it was made it was compulsory in class 6th, and the way I was taught was, agar sandhi viched nahi karoge, to ek kanta pe ek jor ki padegi. And so I ran away from it as far as I could. And just to add to your question, my friend Arvind Krishnan Mehrotra, who's an amazing poet, was asked this question in an interview in 2014. And I want to quote what he said. I do think Sanskrit should be made compulsory in our schools. Imagine the amount of erotic poetry, some of it quite explicit, our children will then be able to read and recite. It's the best introduction to our culture they will ever get. End quote. Right? And I agree. I mean, if somebody had told pimply 13-year-old me addled by hormones that I could read the world's best erotic poetry, I would have jumped to learn Sanskrit. Anyway, so I think there must be many questions in the crowd, so please raise your hands and we'll get a mic to you.
Yeah. My question to all of you. The question is that how this language can be revived, because I heard that in India, as you say, they say it is saffronization, but there are universities and people in the West who are so fascinated by it that they are learning it. So what do you see is the future? Yeah, day before yesterday, I heard an Irish writer. She was saying if kids don't talk in a particular language at home, that language is supposed to be dead. So nobody is talking in Sanskrit at home. But so what can be done now about this language to revive it?
It's not necessary that Sanskrit should be spoken at home only. Of course, Sanskrit is a language of ordinary discourse, but it's also a carrier of knowledge traditions, and that's more valuable. So if we have to acquire knowledge in the field of sciences or technology, mathematics, humanities, and other disciplines, then I think study of Sanskrit would definitely be helpful. It has a rich language, rich literature, rich thought, and it would be beneficial if its richness is exposed. Unfortunately, we do not know the richness of the language, and that's why there is resistance.
Good afternoon, sir. I am Madhun Saxena. I am teaching mechanical engineering. I am teaching the machine learning. I am teaching the automation. So how I integrate my mechanical engineering with your Sanskrit language so my student can take the interest in the Sanskrit? What I have to do and how I can do that?
There are two things. One is we have not just to produce technocrats. We have also to produce good human beings. So along with science and technology, we should also have study of humanities. And for the study of humanities, Sanskrit provides a solid foundation. This is one answer. And so far as the subject matter of your discipline is concerned, well, we do have insights, not detailed expositions, but we do have insights in our literature, say laws of motion. If you want to know the subtleties, you have to read Vaisheshik system. If you want to know human psychology, you have to study the Sankhya system. If you want to know the niceties of language, rules of language interpretation, you have to study Mimamsa system. Well, these systems have insights. Of course, they were propounded long back, and it's not that all that is there should be reproduced, but whatever is good therein, I think we should borrow that. And I would tell you one thing, no culture can survive or thrive if its seminal ideas propounded in the classical text are forgotten or overlooked. So they need to be creatively reinterpreted as per the needs and aspirations of the modern times. Mere aping them is not to be accepted. We have to reinterpret them, and they are capable of being reinterpreted. Ours is not a dead tradition. Ours is a live tradition, particularly in India. I'm addressing the Indians. A live tradition is that which is deeply rooted in the past, firmly footed in the present, but has a glorious view of the future. It is the future we have to keep in mind. And Sanskrit language has that potentiality.
Thank you for a wonderful talk, sir. This is Nitin. I'm a little perplexed by the many meanings, and as I'm wondering, all these shlokas, especially there's a shlok in Ishavasya Upanishad which says ten tak ten bhunjita. So now it is interpreted in two ways. जिसने भोगा उसी ने त्यागा है, जिसने त्यागा वही भोग को जान सकता है. Doesn't it make it a little more confusing? Is there one right answer, one right way to interpret the hymns? Because they have very deep-rooted meaning. Because if I want to understand those Vedic things, what meaning is to be taken? How will I take the right meaning? Or there is no right meaning? Thank you.
Well, I'll answer that very briefly, and then I think isn't it said in about Kavya that you're never going to understand a verse fully until you've read it at least 3 times. Good Kavya, and I think that's the magic, the brilliance, and the cleverness of it, that it can be read so many ways. And no, you absolutely don't privilege one interpretation over the other. And in fact, just before we started, I think it was Professor Bhatt alluded to it, and Vikram was talking about a type of verse that he's been looking at, which consists of 32, I may get this wrong, but 32 syllables, and it can be read as a circle, and you can start anywhere within those 32 syllables and get a coherent verse if you read on. And then, not only that, you can do the same backwards. So the same verse can be read 64 ways, and then apparently each one of those has a shlesha in it. Okay, so the words can be interpreted in 2 different ways. So one verse has 128 different varieties, and I is one of those privileged over any of the others, or are they
No,
all
no,
equally
no.
valid?
Yeah.
There is also the allied tradition of Dvayartha Kavya in Sanskrit, in which one single text, if read from this way to that, has one meaning, and from backwards to front, it is another meaning. I mean, it is simply wonderful, and it's beyond ordinary imagination how people can create the same, with the same verse, or with the same poem, and entirely two different kinds of epics. For example, Raghava Pandaviya. One is, on this way it reads Ramayana, the other way it reads Mahabharata. So it takes so much of time to understand a single shloka, so how much it must have taken for them to compose that kind of, so that's...
Right, and I would just add to that, that even in your verse, which is not designed to have these multiple readings, there is this idea of dhvani, right? And so Abhinavagupta, who's the great 11th century philosopher, he says that really great kavya is great because it has endless meanings. Because the literal meaning of a sentence is one, but the dhvani of a sentence, of a kavya sentence, is endless. And that is what makes it great. So that is what makes poetry great. So I think looking for one meaning is maybe a kind of category error, especially when you're looking at poetry.
We have 3 different modes of interpretation in Sanskrit language. Technically, we call them as Abhida, Lakshana, and Vyanjana. If you resort to Abhida mode, you get one interpretation. If you resort to Lakshana mode, you have another interpretation, and Vyanjana still another. Likewise, about the Vedic thought also, we have different modes of interpretation. So we have Adi Bhautika, Adi Daivika, and Adhyatmika modes. So this is the beauty of Sanskrit language, that it admits of different types of interpretations suiting to different requirements of the situation or mental makeup of the listener.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Could we get a gentleman in, the lady over there? Yes. Go ahead.
Thank you, all of you. It was a perspective-altering session for me. Thank you so much. I have a question for Mr. Chandra. I am Priyanka. I am mother, and I'm learning to be a better mother. I have a question. You said you should not impose things on children. There was Sanskrit imposed on you. You left Sanskrit, and now you're sitting here teaching us Sanskrit. You go back to Sanskrit. Why did you go back to Sanskrit if you didn't like it earlier?
Because I'm a fiction writer. I started writing fiction. I had a character who's a pre-modern Indian poet, and I realized that I didn't know anything about pre-modern Indian poetry. And so I started doing my research and trying to think about this, and then sort of drawn by curiosity, found this endless treasure house of knowledge and beauty and language. And in a very amateur way, please don't think I'm teaching you anything. Next to these people, I'm a child. So I read Sanskrit at a maybe 3rd grade level, but I'm a great amateur enthusiast. So I think, like I think Professor Saab also said, that I think the proper way, the proper pedagogy of teaching anything, not just Sanskrit, is to make it interesting, engaging, so that the child wants to learn it.